The key to faith. When everything is locked, there is nothing ordinary or predictable about the moment you decide to trust God beyond what your eyes can see. Faith, contrary to what many think, is not built on comfort but on courage. The courage to take a step forward, even when everything around you screams at you to stop. The courage to obey, even when human logic is lost in the unknown. Imagine a locksmith standing before an old rusty gate that guards a hidden garden. The key he holds in his hand may or may not work. He has no guarantees, but even so, he approaches, inserts the key, and begins to turn. The gate resists, creaks, seems immobile, but he persists. He turns with patience, effort, and hope, until suddenly the latch gives way. The gate opens, and there, before his eyes, a beauty that has always been there is revealed, but only accessible because he had enough faith to try. This is how faith works in our lives. It's not about seeing to believe, but about trusting before seeing. If you never approach the gate, never turn the key, you'll never see what God has prepared on the other side. Faith invites us to move forward when everything around us tells us to retreat. It leads us to walk toward an invisible promise, believing that God has the right key for every locked door in our story. It is in this context that we find the powerful words of Isaiah 41:10. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. This promise not only comforts, it sustains. It reminds us that even when we don't see the end, God is already there, waiting for our step of faith. God's call always takes us out of our comfort zone. The story of Abram is one of the greatest expressions of this. In Genesis 12:1, God says, "Go from your country, from your relatives and from your father's house, to a land I will show you." He didn't give you a map nor a roadmap, just a direction, a call to trust. Abram had to abandon everything he knew to follow a promise he didn't even fully understand. How often does our walk with God require the same attitude, to give up what is certain, what is known, what is secure, to embrace a future that is still hidden, but promised by a God who never fails? The world teaches us to cling to what we have, to what we master, but God often calls us to let go, to trust. Faith then becomes a movement of surrender, of obedience, of surrender. And even when the sea stands before us, as happened to Moses before the Red Sea, God invites us to stand firm. In Exodus 14:13 we read, "But Moses said to the people, 'Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation the Lord will accomplish for you today.'" And faith is silent but powerful. It doesn't require proof, only presence. It invites us to trust, not in what we see, but in the one who speaks. God doesn't need to show every detail to act. He only needs a heart willing to say, "Yes, Lord." In Peter's life, we see this same principle. In Matthew 14:28-29, when he sees Jesus walking on the water, Peter says, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus responds, "Come." Peter steps out of the boat, the place of safety, and walks toward the impossible. He didn't walk on the water because the water was firm, but because the word was sure. There is a space between the call and the confirmation. Faith lives in that space. Faith acts before the test. It responds to God's voice, even without seeing the result. And it is precisely at this point that many retreat, because they expect guarantees. But God wants obedience. He wants the step before the door opens. Comfort can imprison us. It can make us believe we already have everything we could ever hope for. But faith breaks this prison. It propels us beyond, to where only God can sustain us. And it is precisely there, in this crossing, that the journey of faith truly begins. When faith walks without seeing the path, the journey of faith never begins with a complete map. It begins with a call, and it continues with steps that seem too silent, too uncertain to make sense to the human mind. But it is precisely there, when everything seems uncertain, that God builds the deepest foundations of trust. True faith shines most brightly in moments of uncertainty, when the future is shrouded in fog, when questions outnumber answers. It is in this scenario that faith grows, not by understanding the path, but by trusting in the one who leads. Consider Rahab, a woman who lived in Jericho, an enemy city of Israel. When she heard about the God of the Hebrews, she decided to hide the spies who entered the city, even though she knew that if discovered, she would be killed. She had no guarantees. There were no explicit promises of salvation, only faith in a God she had not yet met personally. personally. In Joshua 2:11 she declares, "The Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath." Rahab acted on something she heard, not saw, and because of that faith, her entire household was saved. The faith she demonstrated in that moment spanned generations. She became part of Jesus' lineage. This teaches us that decisions of faith made in silence can bear eternal fruit. We often expect visible signs, spectacular confirmations, rational certainties. But faith doesn't work that way. It doesn't depend on logic, but on trust. And as Hebrews 11:1 states, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." It's easy to trust when everything seems favorable, but when everything seems against you, that's when faith gains value. It's in this place of darkness that the light of God's promise needs to become your guide. And even if just one step is illuminated, that step is enough. God doesn't reveal the entire path. He reveals the next step. The people of Israel learned this in the desert. God didn't give them food for the entire week. He sent manna day after day. Each morning was a new invitation to trust. And in Exodus 16:15, the people look at the miracle and ask, "What is this?" Because they didn't recognize divine provision. How often do we also question what God gives us because it doesn't come in the way we expected? God was teaching dependence, teaching trust, teaching daily faith. In the same way, Mary, the mother of Jesus, received news that would change the course of humanity. An angel appeared and told her that she would carry the Son of God. She didn't know all the detail. She didn't know how Joseph would react. She didn't know how the people would treat her. But even so, she responded in Luke 1:38, "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." This is the sound of true faith, a yes to God, even when everything inside you is trying to understand how it will happen. When you say yes to heaven, even trembling inside, God moves. Faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is decision. It is deciding to trust, even when afraid. It is deciding to walk, even when you can't see where you're stepping. And it is in this attitude that miracles happen. It is in this invisible territory that God's hand reveals itself. Perhaps today you are faced with a choice, a dark path, a gate that seems locked, an inner voice that says it won't work. But on the other side, God whispers, "Trust me, I am with you." He is not asking you to understand everything. He is asking only that you trust, that you take the first step, that you respond with faith. Even when everything seems silent, even when prayers are not answered immediately, even when heaven seems closed, know that God is still working. He does not forget those he trusts. He does not ignore those who choose to walk in faith. And at the end of it all, you will look back and realize every uncertain step, every tear, every silence, it was all part of the plan. A plan greater than you could ever imagine. Faith is the path that takes us beyond who we are to where God is calling us to be. When faith becomes action, believing is the first step. But it is acting on what one believes that truly unleashes the power of God. Faith that remains only in thought is like a seed kept in a drawer, full of potential but incapable of bearing fruit. Faith needs to leave the heart and reach the feet. It needs to transform into movement, into obedience. It is precisely at this point that many get lost. Because obedience often hurts. It demands surrender. It involves risk. It goes against logic and pride. Consider the case of Naaman, commander of the Syrian army, a powerful, influential man, and a leper. He went to the prophet Elisha seeking healing. He expected a solemn ceremony, perhaps impressive words or a miraculous gesture, but what he received was a simple command. Go and dip yourself 7 times in the Jordan River. Naaman was indignant. This was ridiculous in his eye. But then, overcome by humility and convinced by his servants, he obeyed. And in 2 Kings 5:14 we read, "Then he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was cleansed." The healing didn't come from desire, nor from intention. It came from action. When he finally obeyed, the miracle happened. How many blessings has God prepared for us that have not yet manifested, simply because we lack the step of faith into obedience? How many healings, open doors, reconciliations, and answers are just waiting for us to say, "Yes, Lord." It is not obedience itself that has the power, but the God who honors that obedience. It is He who acts when we take the step. Consider also the widow of Zarephath, who lived in despair due to scarcity. She had only a handful of flour and a little oil. She was ready to prepare her last meal and then await death. But God sent the prophet Elijah to her with an instruction. First, prepare a cake for me. This seems cruel at first, asking for the last meal of a mother and her son, but there was a promise behind it. Your jar of flour will not run out, nor will your jug of oil run dry. She obeyed, and as it is written in 1 Kings 17:15, she went and did as Elijah had said, and she and her household ate for many days. Her obedience released supernatural provision. God used her little to reveal his much. This teaches us something powerful. When we obey, even in fear, even in scarcity, even without understanding, God steps in with abundance. Obedience transforms the invisible into the visible, the promise into reality. But we must take the step. Jesus showed this clearly with the 10 lepers who came to him in Luke 17. He didn't heal them immediately. He simply said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And the text says, "And it came to pass as they went that they were cleansed." Luke 17:14. They were healed as they walked, as they obeyed. If they had stood still, waiting for healing before obeying, they would never have been healed. Healing was on the other side of obedience. This principle is eternal. Faith needs to move. It needs to obey even when everything inside us wants to wait. You might even say, "But my faith is weak. I'm not that courageous." That's okay. God isn't expecting perfection. He's expecting willingness. He honors even a shaky yes. He transforms your weakness into strength and your hesitation into testimony. He only wants your step. The rest he will do. And know this, every act of obedience is a living testimony. People around you see it. They are inspired. They learn. Your act of faith can trigger transformation in others. Your step can open paths for the faith of others to flourish. So even if it seems small, even if it seems crazy, even if it hurts, obey, trust, take the step, and watch God move. True faith doesn't just believe, it moves. And when it moves, God moves with it. The door that only opens with obedience. Faith that transforms into obedience has the power to move the supernatural. When you choose to trust God above your circumstances and act on that trust, something is unlocked in the unseen. The heavens move when a person's heart responds with sincere obedience. The problem is that many want the promise, but not the process. They want the miracle, but avoid the movement. They expect God to do everything while they remain still. But in almost every biblical story, God responds after a step of faith. Consider the case of Joshua before the walls of Jericho. God didn't surrender Jericho to Israel with human weapons or strategies. Instead, he gave an order that to human eyes seemed absurd. March around the city for 7 days, and on the 7th day give a shout of faith. Joshua obeyed. And in Joshua 6:20 we read, "And it came to pass, when the priests blew the trumpets, that the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down." It wasn't the sound of the shout, it was the power of obedience. God tore down the walls, but it was the people who had to go around them every day, even without seeing a single crack. They obeyed before any evidence appeared. How many times when faced with obstacles do we wait for God to tear down the walls before we begin walking? But God is saying, walk, obey, and then you will see. Obedience activates the power of God. It is the key that opens doors that had been locked for a long time. Remember also Peter walking on the water. The storm was raging, the winds were strong, and yet when he heard Jesus' voice saying, "Come," he got out of the boat, not because the sea had calmed down, but because he trusted the one who was calling. Matthew 14:29 says, "Then Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water to Jesus." Peter didn't walk on the water because the water was firm. He walked because Jesus' word was firm. This is faith in action. This is obedience that defies logic. You may be hearing God calling you to do something that seems impossible, irrational, even frightening. But if it was God who said come, then go. Solidity isn't in the ground. It's in the word that sustains you. Obedience is often contrary to how we feel. Sometimes obeying God means forgiving when we want revenge. It means giving when we feel we need to hold on. It means going when everything inside us wants to stay. But every time we say yes, even when we struggle inside, God reveals himself more. He doesn't expect us to be strong. He expects us to be faithful. Consider what Hebrews 11:6 says, "And without faith it is is impossible to please him. For anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. God rewards those who seek him with faith, and faith without action is dead. This means he is looking for those who not only say, "Lord, I believe," but also live as those who believe. Perhaps you are waiting for a sign, for confirmation, for greater assurance before taking the next step. But what if the true sign is the peace you feel, even when everything isn't resolved? What if confirmation is the gentle conviction in your spirit saying, "Trust and go"? It's not about having everything under control. It's about recognizing that God is in control. When you understand this, obedience ceases to be a burden and becomes a privilege. You begin to see each act of obedience as a gateway to something greater. And even if you don't see immediate results, know this: God is at work. No obedience is in vain. No step of faith is wasted. You may not realize it now, but all heaven moves when a child of God chooses to obey. Obedience isn't about merit, it's about trust. And when you trust, you surrender. And when you surrender, God works. The power of quiet obedience. There are times in life when obeying God doesn't bring the spotlight, doesn't generate applause or recognition. Sometimes obedience is silent, hidden, done in secret. But it is precisely in these times that God works most, because what is done in secret, he rewards in the light of day. The Bible is full of stories in which the act of obedience seemed small to human eyes, but great before God. One of the most striking examples is that of Mary, the young woman who received the news from the angel that she would be the mother of the Savior of the world. She could have questioned, refused, doubted, but her answer was simple and profound, as recorded in Luke 1:38. "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." This phrase changed the history of humanity. There was no resistance, only surrender. Mary didn't know what the future would hold. She had no control over the social, emotional, and spiritual consequences of that decision, but she trusted and he obeyed. This shows us that true obedience doesn't require certainty, it requires faith, and this is where many become discouraged, because they want to obey, but they want guarantees. They want to serve, but with security. They want to say yes to God, but only if they know exactly what will happen next. However, true faith begins when control ends. When you say, "Lord, I don't know what will come, but I trust in who you are." And then obedience gains eternal value. There's also the example of the fisherman in Luke 5. After a whole night trying to catch fish and catching nothing, Jesus said to Peter, "Let down the net again." Humanly, it didn't make sense. They had already tried everything. They were tired. But Peter replied, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." The Luke 5:5. That at your word changed everything. They obeyed, and the catch was so abundant that the nets nearly broke. Sometimes you're just like Peter, tired, frustrated, seeing no results. But when the command comes from God, a history of failure doesn't matter. What matters is the faithfulness of the one who orders the net to be cast. And he never fails. God honors those who obey even when they're exhausted. He rewards those who continue to believe when everything says otherwise. Obedience, especially in exhaustion, is a profound form of worship. It's proof that you trust the word more than your circumstances. And maybe you're in that place today. You've tried everything. You've prayed, you've cried, you've waited. And God is saying, cast the net again, forgive again, try again, believe again. Obey, even without strength, even without understanding, because the harvest is in the next step of faith. It's not about seeing the result immediately. It's about believing that God has already prepared the result and is just waiting for you to act. Faith is what connects us to heaven, but obedience is what brings heaven to earth. Never underestimate the power of silent obedience. That decision that only you and God know. That forgiveness no one saw. That generosity made anonymously. God sees, God honors, and in his time he rewards. Hebrews 6:10 confirms this clearly. For God is not unrighteous, so as to forget your work and labor of love which you have shown for his name. God does not forget. Every step of obedience, every act of faith, every sacrifice for love of him is being recorded in heaven. And at the right moment he opens the heavens over your life. So keep obeying, even in silence, even in the dark, even in the desert. God is at work. You may not see it yet, but the miracle has already already begun the moment you said yes. Obedience in waiting. When silence is a test of faith, waiting is perhaps one of the greatest tests of faith. It's easy to obey when God's answer is immediate, when the signs are clear and the paths open before us. But what do we do when everything is silent, when we obey and nothing changes? It is in this dry and seemingly barren terrain that true faith is cultivated. Because obedience in waiting requires more than strength. It requires deep trust. It requires intimacy with God. Consider the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised a son. They obeyed, they trusted, but time passed, and more passed. Years of waiting, silence, doubt, aging. The body said no. Logic said impossible. But heaven said, wait. And in Genesis 21:1-2, we see, the Lord visited Sarah as he had promised, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age. God's timing is not like ours. He is never late, even when everything seems past its due date. Abraham's obedience wasn't just about walking to a new land. It was also about remaining faithful throughout the years, even without seeing the promise. This is where many give up. They obey for a while, but then back off. They pray for a while, but then grow weary. They believe for a while, but are disappointed by the silence. But God doesn't work in haste. He works with purpose, and waiting is part of that purpose, not to punish us, but to prepare us. James 1:4 exhorts us, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Obedience during waiting perfects our faith. It molds us, purifies us, strengthens us. God is not just preparing the blessing for you, He is preparing you for the blessing. Perhaps you are exactly in that place. You have obeyed. You have taken the step of faith. You have renounced. You have surrendered. But heaven remains silent. Know this: God's silence is never absence. He is working even if you can't see it. Remember the Israelites in the wilderness. For 40 years, they walked under God's guidance, cloud by day, fire by night. And yet, many times, they felt alone. But God's presence never abandoned them. Even when the manna seemed too simple, even when the path seemed repetitive, God was there. The lesson: persevere. Keep obeying. Keep marching. Keep believing. What sustains you is not what you see, but what God has promised. Obedience in waiting also trains us to depend less on results and more on presence. When everything is going well, it's easy to trust. But in times of scarcity, doubt, and delay, that's when you learn to trust in who God is, not just in what He can do. And make no mistake, the devil tries to use waiting to steal your faith. He whispers, God has forgotten you. Nothing will change. This prayer will not be answered. But the truth is different. God works in silence with powerful hands. Isaiah 64:4 says, For since the beginning of time no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eye has seen any God besides you, who acts for those who wait for Him. Yes, God works for those who wait for Him. Waiting in faith is obeying, even without understanding. And when you remain steadfast, even without answers, you are saying to heaven and hell, my faith does not depend on circumstances. It depends on the faithfulness of my God. This faith moves God's heart. This silent obedience, this faithfulness in the dark, these are seeds that will bear powerful fruit. And when the time is right, you will see that it was worth the wait. When obedience becomes testimony, there is something powerful and eternal that happens when a life is marked by sincere obedience to God. It's not just an isolated act of faith, but a testimony that reverberates, inspires, transforms, and opens doors for others to rise up as well. Obedience isn't just about you. It reaches other lives, it touches future generations, it leaves a trail of glory wherever it goes. It was the same with Noah, who obeyed God before any sign of rain, before any storm. He built the ark at a time when talk of a flood was foolish, and the result, his family was saved. He became a witness to God's faithfulness in a world that ignored him. Genesis 6:22 says, So Noah did, according to all that God commanded him, so he did. Note, according to all, not partially, not halfway. Noah's obedience was total, and it is this complete obedience that generates transformation. Perhaps you are being called to do something that others don't understand. Perhaps your family doesn't understand your faith. Your friends don't see the sense in your decisions. But if God has commanded it, obey, because what He will do through your life will serve as a testimony to everyone around you. Just like Joshua, who saw the walls of Jericho fall, he didn't win by force, but by obedience. God commanded them to march. in silence, for days, and only at the end to shout. To human eyes it was absurd, but it was exact obedience that brought victory. Joshua 6:20 records, "The people shouted, and the priests blew the trumpets. And it came to pass, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, that they shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down." This victory was not just a military conquest. It was a testimony of what God can do when the people choose to obey to the last detail. And so it is with us. When we obey, even without understanding, we are proclaiming to the world that we trust in God beyond all logic. This lived faith becomes a light for those around us. It's as Jesus said in Matthew 5:14, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Your obedience shines. It doesn't go unnoticed. Even if you think no one sees it, someone is being inspired by your example. Someone is being encouraged by your perseverance. Someone is believing again because of your yes." This is how obedience becomes a testimony, and testimony in turn generates faith in others. As Romans 10:17 teaches us, "So then faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God." When you obey, you become the living preaching of that word. You become an open letter, a gospel incarnate, a tangible example that God still works in the lives of those who follow him. Remember Daniel. He prayed 3 times a day, even under threat of death. He obeyed God and was thrown into the lion's den. But his faith and courage not only saved him, they touched the king of Babylon. In Daniel 6:26, the king himself declared, "I make a decree that in all my kingdom people will tremble and fear before the God of Daniel." A single obedient life changed an empire, and it can happen to you. Never underestimate what God can do through your faithfulness. Sometimes transformation in your home, your workplace, or your community will not come from grand speeches, but from your daily example of faithful obedience. When you forgive those who have hurt you, you are preaching. When you remain steadfast in faith through pain, you are preaching. When you love those who reject you, you are preaching. When you continue praying even without answers, you are preaching. Your testimony has a voice. Your obedience has an impact. And even if today seems small, God is writing a bigger story, a story where your life will be living proof that he is faithful to fulfill what he promised.